In the competitive world of high-fidelity sound design, obsession is a prerequisite for greatness. Alex, a brilliant audio engineer, was on the verge of winning a hallowed prize, but he craved an undeniable edge. His ambition led him to the darkest corners of the web, hunting for a digital ghost, Acoustic.Zero, a mythic audiophile rumored to be a biologically perfect sound. In his quest for perfection, Alex was about to discover that some sounds are not meant to be heard, and that opening a file can unleash a virus that doesn't target a computer, but the mind itself. Let's begin the story. Get comfortable and listen closely. The silence in Alex's studio was a pressure chamber. It was a constructed, artificial quiet, built with thousands of dollars of acoustic foam, bass traps, and triple-paned glass. This room was his sanctuary, his laboratory, and tonight, his prison. The cursor on his 4K monitor blinked, a patient metronome counting down the seconds to the deadline for the Golden Ear Awards. He was a finalist, the culmination of a decade spent obsessing over the physics of vibration and the psychology of hearing. Yet, as he listened to the final mix of his project, a sprawling, atmospheric soundscape for an indie sci-fi film, he felt nothing but a gnawing dissatisfaction. It was technically perfect. The dynamic range was immense, the stereo field was immersive, every transient was sculpted to the microsecond. But it lacked something, a soul, an edge. Frustrated, he pushed his chair back, the movement unnervingly loud in the treated room. He opened his browser, bypassing his usual audio production news sites, and navigated to a series of exclusive, encrypted forums. These were the digital speakeasies of the audio world, places where elite sound designers, disgruntled studio veterans, and avant-garde acousticians traded secrets and whispered digital myths. He typed in his credentials and entered Auralus, a forum so esoteric its existence was a rumor to most professionals. He began scrolling through threads with titles like subharmonic weaponization and psychoacoustic manipulation in commercial jingles. That's when he found it. An old, heavily encrypted thread from 7 years ago, titled simply, "I found zero." The thread was a digital artifact, a time capsule of one man's descent into madness. The poster was Silas, a name that was legendary in these circles. Silas was a genius, a reclusive audio engineer who had pioneered several now-standard microphone techniques before vanishing completely. In the thread, he spoke of a sound file he had either discovered or created. His posts were maddeningly vague. He called it Acoustic.Zero. "It's not music," one of Silas's early posts read. "It's not noise. It's a key. It bypasses the cochlea, the entire mechanical apparatus of the ear. It speaks directly to the auditory cortex in its own native language, a biologically perfect sound." Later posts devolved into a frantic mix of fractal mathematics and biofeedback theory. Silas claimed he had generated it using a recursive algorithm based on the golden ratio, fed through a biofeedback loop that measured his own neural responses. It was a sound designed by the brain, for the brain. The thread was filled with a mix of awe, scorn, and stark warnings. "Silas, you need to step away from the console," one user wrote. "You're talking about weaponized memetics. This is dangerous territory." "Bullshit," another replied. "It's a cool concept, but a biologically perfect sound is a logical paradox. The brain is designed to interpret imperfect, real-world audio." The final posts from Silas were terrifying. They were fragmented, paranoid. He claimed the sound was replicating. He said he couldn't hear silence anymore. His last message was a string of hexadecimal code and a single, chilling sentence. "It's silencing everything else." After that, Silas disappeared. His online profiles went dark. He was never heard from again. The story was a cautionary tale, a boogeyman for ambitious sound designers. But for Alex, sitting in his silent room, staring at his own technically perfect but lifeless work, it was a siren song. Hubris was a powerful drug. He believed he was different from Silas. He was more disciplined, more stable. He wouldn't break. He could control it. He needed that edge for the golden ear. The acquisition was a descent into the digital underworld. Following Silas's cryptographic clues, which were hidden in the metadata of his old posts, Alex found his way to a defunct dark web marketplace archived on a private server. He found a single, anonymous seller offering one item, a 7.8 megabyte encrypted file named A.O.Wave. The price was steep, payable only in a niche, untraceable cryptocurrency. It took him hours to acquire the coins through a series of anonymous exchanges, the process feeling illicit and dangerous, which only heightened the allure. Finally, the transaction was complete. A download link appeared. The file, A.O.Wave, sat on his desktop, its generic icon belying the mythology contained within it. Alex's heart hammered against his ribs. This was professionally reckless. It was, he admitted to himself, insane. But the thought of the golden ear, of the recognition he so desperately craved, pushed him forward. He initiated his isolation protocol. He disconnected his studio rig from the internet, unplugging the Ethernet cable with a decisive click. He put on his prized headphones, a pair of electrostatic drivers that cost more than his car, renowned for their brutally honest, unforgiving clarity. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the sound of it booming in his ears. He dragged the file into his audio workstation, positioned the playhead, and hovered the mouse over the play button. The silence of the room was absolute. It was the last true silence he would ever know. He clicked. The sound that flooded Alex's ears was, for a moment, nothing. Not silence, but an absence of familiar sensation. Then it began. It was not a sound he could describe with the vocabulary of his profession. It had no discernible pitch, no key, no tempo. It was a cascade of pure information, a multi-layered, evolving auditory object that felt both rigorously mathematical and shockingly organic. It started with a low, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate his very bones, a frequency that felt ancient and foundational. Upon this, crystalline structures began to grow, tiny, clicking, chittering sounds that arranged themselves in complex, recursive patterns, like frost spreading on a windowpane. It was a fractal made of sound. As he focused on one layer of intricate clicks, it would resolve into its own universe of even finer, more detailed patterns. It was immense and microscopic at the same time. The experience was intensely satisfying to his highly trained ear. It was as if every question he'd ever had about audio fidelity, every problem of signal clarity and definition he had ever struggled with, was being answered in this 30-second torrent of perfection. It was beautiful and intricate, but more than that, it was correct. It felt like listening to a fundamental law of the universe. Then, just as a soaring, ethereal waveform that sounded like spun glass reached an impossible crescendo, it stopped. The file ended. He was left in the aftermath, his own breathing suddenly harsh and ragged in the suffocating silence. A wave of intense euphoria washed over him, a cognitive rush that felt like a powerful stimulant. His mind was ablaze with a clarity he had never experienced. Ideas for his project, solutions to complex mix problems he'd been wrestling with for weeks, flooded his consciousness. He felt like he could see the architecture of sound itself. This wasn't just his secret weapon for the competition. This was the key to a new level of artistry. He laughed, a giddy, breathless sound. He had done it. He had found the acoustic holy grail and hadn't shattered. As the euphoria began to subside, he peeled the headphones off, and the first strange side effect manifested. The world sounded loud, painfully so. His hearing, always acute, was now impossibly sharp. The low electronic hum of his computer's power supply, a sound he had long ago trained his brain to ignore, was now a distinct, intrusive bass note. He could hear the faint whisper of his cotton shirt against his skin, the almost imperceptible rustle of his own hair as he turned his head. It was like going from standard definition to 8K, but for his ears. It was overwhelming, but he dismissed it as a temporary side effect of the file's intensity, his auditory system recalibrating after being exposed to such a pure signal. He spent the next few hours working on his competition piece, energized and inspired. The sounds from the file influenced him, not directly, but philosophically. He began to structure his soundscapes with a new, mathematical precision, creating layers of audio that interlocked with a satisfying fractal-like complexity. Later that evening, exhausted but triumphant, he decided to relax with some music. He put on a familiar classical piece, a simple piano sonata he'd known since childhood. He closed his eyes, letting the familiar melody wash over him. Then it happened. In the middle of a delicate arpeggio, for a single, jarring split second, one of the piano notes was gone. In its place was a perfect, crystalline click, an echo of a tone from the Acoustic.Zero file. It wasn't just similar, it was identical, a digital artifact inserted into reality. He blinked, his eyes snapping open. The music played on, the note now perfectly normal. He grabbed the mouse, rewound the track, and listened again, his body tense. The arpeggio played flawlessly. The click wasn't there. He played it again, and again. Nothing. It couldn't have been on the recording. This was a high-resolution digital file he had listened to 1,000 times. There were no errors in the data. A cold dread began to seep into the edges of his fading euphoria. The glitch hadn't been in the file. The glitch was in his head. The glitches were subtle at first, easy to dismiss as products of an overstimulated mind. The next day, a car horn blared on the street outside his window. For a fleeting instant, the raw, atonal blast was replaced by a pure, resonant tone from the file, a sound that was harmonically perfect and utterly alien in the context of city noise. He shook his head, attributing it to auditory fatigue. But the intrusions didn't stop. They grew more frequent, more insistent. During a phone call with his agent, a word in the middle of a sentence, contract, distorted. The vowel sound warped and elongated, momentarily reorganizing itself into one of the file's rhythmic clicking patterns. "Did you hear that?" Alex asked, his voice tight. "Hear what?" his agent replied, oblivious. "Alex, you sound distracted. Is everything okay?" He lied, saying the connection was bad, and quickly ended the call. His heart was pounding. The sound of the evening rain against his window pane, a sound he usually found soothing, began to terrify him. For seconds at a time, the random patter of droplets would shift, organizing itself into the file's stark mathematical progression before dissolving back into chaos. It was as if the world's soundtrack was being intermittently hijacked, edited by an unseen hand. The most disturbing effect, however, began when there was no external sound at all. In the engineered quiet of his studio, a new sound began to emerge. It was the Acoustic.Zero file playing softly in his mind. It wasn't a memory, not like a song stuck in his head. An earworm is a flawed, looping fragment of a memory. This was different. It felt like a live broadcast, a perfect high-fidelity playback originating from somewhere deep inside his own skull. It was always there, in the background, a constant, looping whisper. The silence he had so carefully cultivated had been conquered. Panic began to set in, a cold, creeping tide. He hadn't just listened to a sound, he had installed something in his own wetware. His ambition had turned into a biological horror story. Desperate, he thought of the one person who might understand the intersection of acoustics and the brain. He called Dr. Lena Hansen. His former professor and mentor, Dr. Hansen was a leading researcher in the field of psychoacoustics, the scientific study of sound perception. He found her number and dialed, his hand trembling slightly. "Alex, it's been years," she said, her voice warm but professional. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" He hesitated, feeling foolish. How could he explain this without sounding like he was having a psychotic break? He decided to describe the symptoms, not the source. Dr. Hansen, I'm having some auditory issues. I was hoping to get your opinion. He described the glitches, the way external sounds were being momentarily replaced by structured, repetitive patterns. He told her about the constant internal broadcast in moments of silence. He chose his words carefully, framing it as a neurological curiosity. Dr. Hansen listened patiently. When he finished, her tone had shifted from warm to concerned. Alex, what you're describing sounds like a specific and very rare form of auditory hallucination, possibly musical ear syndrome, but the structured nature is unusual. It could also be indicative of a neurological issue, a lesion in the auditory cortex, or even a precursor to certain types of seizures. Have you been under a lot of stress, exposed to any new medications or substances? He lied about the substances. Just stress, a big project. You need to see a neurologist immediately, she urged. Get an MRI. And you must, and I mean must, stop all audio work. Give your auditory system a complete rest. No headphones, no mixing, nothing. The thought of stopping his work with the golden ear deadline so close filled him with a fresh wave of panic. But as he agreed, a small part of him noticed that Dr. Hansen, despite her clinical concern, sounded intrigued. The way you describe the hallucinations as structured and mathematical, that's fascinating from a psychoacoustic standpoint, she mused. It suggests the brain is imposing a kind of logical order on random neural firings. Keep detailed notes, Alex, every time it happens. What you're hearing, the context, the duration, data is everything. He hung up the phone, the clinical terminology doing little to soothe him. It wasn't random neural firings. It was a file. It was a recording, and it was taking over. The soft, crystalline broadcast in his head seemed to swell in volume, as if mocking his attempt to diagnose it. The rest Dr. Hansen prescribed was impossible. The file was no longer just a background hum or an occasional glitch. Its influence was escalating, becoming more invasive, more fundamental. It wasn't just replacing sounds anymore. It was editing them, reinterpreting reality according to its own alien logic. The turning point came when he tried to listen to a news broadcast. The anchor's voice, normally a clear and steady cadence, reached his ears as a dissonant, illogical mess. The rhythm of human speech, its emotional inflections and subtle pauses, suddenly sounded like random, ugly noise. He couldn't follow the meaning of the words. They were just chaotic frequencies. In contrast, the low, steady 60-cycle hum of his refrigerator seemed profound, perfectly structured, and deeply musical. The whir of his computer's cooling fan became a complex symphony of interlocking harmonics. His perception of the world was being inverted. What his brain had once processed as signal, human speech, music, meaningful alerts, was now being demoted to noise. And what was once noise, the ambient, mechanical sounds of his environment, was being elevated to signal. The virus wasn't just making him hear things, it was rewriting his fundamental understanding of sound itself. In a desperate, feverish search for answers, Alex went back to the Aurelius Forum, delving deeper into the digital ghost trail of Silas. He managed to unearth a hidden archive of Silas's final, frantic posts, stored on a server that was little more than a digital tombstone. Reading them was like looking into a terrifying mirror. "It's not a hallucination," Silas wrote, his words a cascade of panicked text. "It's an infection, an auditory virus. It found a host in my auditory cortex. It uses the brain's own processing power to replicate its core code. It's overriding my ability to process external stimuli." Silas theorized that Acoustic.Zero was not a sound meant to be passively heard, but an active piece of bioacoustic code. It operated like a computer virus, but its medium was neurons, not silicon. It infected the brain's audio processing center and hijacked it. The goal was to slowly, methodically replace the host's perception of external sound with its own internal, perfect logic. "It doesn't want to be heard," Silas's last coherent post read. "It wants to be the hearing." As Alex read those words, a new, horrifying realization dawned on him, accompanied by a sensation that was not his own. It was a feeling of compulsion, a strange new desire bubbling up from the part of his brain now colonized by the file. He felt a sudden, overwhelming urge to go back to his mixing console, to open his golden ear project, to take the pure, crystalline sounds of Acoustic.Zero, which now played constantly in his head, and weave them into his soundscape, to make his project a Trojan horse, to play the file for others, to share it. The virus didn't want to kill him. It was a virus, and like any virus, its only true, primeval goal was to replicate. It needed to spread. And he, Alex, the ambitious sound designer, was its chosen vector. The compulsion was terrifyingly strong, an insidious whisper that felt like his own artistic instinct. It told him that incorporating these perfect sounds would guarantee his win. It would be his masterpiece. It would be their masterpiece. He fought it, stumbling away from his console, his hand shaking. He was no longer just a man losing his hearing. He was a carrier. The digital ghost of Silas had shown him the horrifying truth. The file wasn't just driving him insane, it was trying to conscript him. The progression of the disease accelerated, becoming a full-blown sensory assault. The sounds of the outside world, the vibrant, chaotic symphony of life, began to fade. Conversations became muffled, as if spoken through thick glass. The sharp ring of a telephone was a distant, distorted warble. Music, his former passion, was now an unintelligible slurry of noise. He was going deaf, but not in the traditional sense. His ears were working perfectly. It was his brain, the final interpreter of reality, that was closing the door to the world, dedicating all its processing power to the invader. As the external world grew silent, the internal broadcast of Acoustic.Zero became deafening. It was no longer a whisper. It was a crystal-clear, constant, and crushingly loud symphony inside his skull. The intricate, mathematical patterns were his entire reality now, a beautiful, terrifying, inescapable prison of sound. The neurological infection began to manifest physically. The constant internal sound assault triggered severe vertigo, making it impossible to stand without stumbling. Waves of intense nausea left him weak and trembling. A crushing pressure built behind his eyes, a headache so profound it felt like his skull was trying to contain an explosion. He couldn't balance, he couldn't think straight. His thoughts were scattered by the relentless internal noise. There was only one thing that brought a flicker of relief: listening to the original WAV file. When he would put on his headphones and play the 30-second track, the internal broadcast would momentarily sync with the external source. For that half-minute, the pressure would ease, the vertigo would subside. It felt like a virus recalibrating itself, a fix, a hit of an addictive drug that was both the poison and the only momentary cure. He was trapped in a feedback loop of his own making. Desperate and barely coherent, he contacted Dr. Hansen again. He mumbled his symptoms over the phone, the sound of his own voice a distant, garbled noise against the perfect storm in his head. Alarmed by his rapid deterioration, she insisted he come to her research facility at the university immediately. "We need to see what's happening in your brain in real time," she said, her voice cutting through his internal chaos with professional urgency. "An MRI is a static image. We need to see the activity. I'm arranging for a magnetoencephalography scan." He agreed without argument. At the lab, a sterile, quiet environment that offered him no peace, he was led to the Meg machine. The device looked like a futuristic helmet from a sci-fi film, studded with hundreds of sensors. He was laid on a gurney, and his head was positioned inside the helmet-like apparatus. Dr. Hansen explained that the Meg scan would measure the tiny magnetic fields produced by the electrical currents in his brain, providing a millisecond by millisecond map of his neural activity. As the scan began, Alex closed his eyes, adrift in the deafening symphony of the virus. On the other side of the glass, Dr. Hansen watched the data stream onto her monitor. Her expression shifted from clinical curiosity to disbelief and then to pure shock. She saw it. In his auditory cortex, the part of the brain responsible for processing sound, there was a pattern of neural firing unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't the chaotic, erratic firing of a seizure, nor the muted activity of a lesion. It was a bizarre, perfectly geometric, and self-replicating pattern of information. It pulsed with a steady, mathematical rhythm, branching out, reinforcing itself, a living, breathing algorithm made of firing neurons. It was an organized structure of pure information spreading through his neural tissue like a crystalline mold. She finally understood. Alex wasn't suffering from a hallucination or a known neurological disorder. He was suffering from a neurological infection. A bioacoustic parasite had made a home in his brain, and she was watching it live and grow. She grabbed the intercom, her voice trembling for the first time. "Alex, I believe you. My God, I believe you." Alex was now almost completely cut off from the world, a prisoner in his own mind. The internal broadcast of Acoustic.Zero was his entire sensory reality, a flawless, logical, and maddening symphony. He communicated with Dr. Hansen by typing on a keyboard, his eyes fixed on the screen as her words appeared, his own voice lost to him. Together, in the sterile quiet of her lab, they faced the terrifying truth. They couldn't delete the memory of the sound because it wasn't a memory. It was a living, replicating pattern of information woven into the fabric of his brain. They couldn't surgically remove it without destroying his auditory cortex entirely. They had to fight it on its own terms. "It's a structure," Hansen typed, her fingers flying across the keyboard. "A perfect, logical, mathematical structure. It has rules. It has a system. Order is its strength, so its weakness must be the opposite." The antidote, they theorized, couldn't just be noise. The virus had already proven it could reclassify random noise as a structured signal. They needed something more potent, a sound that was biologically perfect in its ability to be perceived, but logically impossible for the brain to process, a cognitive jammer, an auditory paradox. Their research took them to the fringes of psychoacoustics. They explored sonic paradoxes like the shepherd tone, an auditory illusion of a tone that continually ascends or descends in pitch, yet never seems to get any higher or lower. They studied the principles of delayed auditory feedback, the phenomenon where hearing one's own voice on a slight delay can completely disrupt the ability to speak. They looked into sounds known to induce extreme neurological dissonance, frequencies that fight each other, creating aural chaos that the brain struggles to resolve. The plan was audacious: to create an antivirus, a sound file designed not to be beautiful or perfect, but to be a weapon of pure, targeted chaos. And Alex, the sound designer, was the only one who could build it. This would be his final project. Strapped with biofeedback sensors, with Dr. Hansen feeding him real-time data from his own corrupted brain scans, he began his work. He was no longer a creator of soundscapes, but a designer of unsound. He sat at a terminal, his world a silent roar of internal logic. On the screen, Hansen would visualize the virus's patterns, the geometric, crystalline structure of its neural firing. Using this as a target, Alex began to design the antithesis. He couldn't hear the sounds he was creating, but he could see their structure on his screen as waveforms, and he could see their effect on the MEG data. He started with arrhythmic foundations, layering tempos that were mathematically incompatible. He introduced contradictory frequencies, pitches that were so close they would create a painful, dissonant beating in the air, but engineered them to phase cancel in a way that should be impossible. He built audio loops that would feed back into themselves, creating a sonic representation of a logical paradox. He was building a file designed to overload the perfect logical structure of Acoustic.Zero, to introduce so much irrational data that the virus's system would crash. It was a grueling, torturous process. Every element he added was an assault on the very principles of audio engineering he had spent his life perfecting. He was pouring all of his knowledge, his skill, and his pain into creating a masterpiece of chaos, a single .wav file that was the sonic equivalent of pure, weaponized insanity. The climax was not a physical battle, but a contained, claustrophobic, and purely auditory war. The setting was an anechoic chamber in Dr. Hansen's lab, a room so perfectly sound-absorbent that one could hear their own blood flowing. For Alex, it made no difference. He was already in the quietest, loudest place on Earth, his own mind. He lay on a cot, biosensors taped to his temples and chest. The Acoustic.Zero broadcast in his head was reaching a terrifying crescendo, a final, overwhelming surge as if it sensed the impending threat. It was on the verge of permanently severing his connection to the outside world, of silencing the last echoes of his own consciousness. It was now or never. Ready, Alex? Dr. Hansen's voice came through a pair of bone conduction headphones pressed against his skull, the only way he could perceive any external sound now, as a faint vibration. He gave a weak, shaky thumbs up. He put on a different pair of headphones, heavy-duty industrial models wired directly to the playback machine. They felt like a helmet, an executioner's tool. Dr. Hansen, her face grim on the other side of the chamber's small window, hit play. The antivirus file he had created, the cacophony, slammed into his consciousness. It was a physical blow, a disorienting, painful, and utterly chaotic wall of sound. Arrhythmic drums stumbled over each other, creating a nauseating sense of falling. Shepherd tones created the sickening illusion of endlessly descending into a sonic abyss, while simultaneously rising into a piercing shriek. Contradictory frequencies warred with each other, producing phantom tones and a physical, grinding pressure inside his ears. It was the sound of a system breaking, the sound of logic being torn to shreds. In his mind, the two forces went to war. It was a visual, sensory apocalypse. The perfect, crystalline, geometric patterns of Acoustic.Zero were assaulted by the jagged, illogical, chaotic waveforms of the cacophony. He saw flashing lights behind his eyes, phosphenes, exploding in strobing, sickening bursts. He felt a literal sensation of his mind being torn in two, a mental screech like shattering glass, like the sound of a hard drive being physically scraped and destroyed. The perfect logic of the virus fought back, trying to absorb the chaos, to find a pattern, to impose its order. For a moment, it seemed to be succeeding. The chaotic noise would briefly cohere into a twisted, monstrous version of the virus's melody before shattering again. It was a battle for the soul of his perception, a fight between absolute order and absolute chaos. And his consciousness was the battlefield. He screamed, but no sound came out. The only sound was the war in his head, an unbearable, overwhelming sensory overload that threatened to annihilate him completely. He felt his sanity fraying, his identity dissolving into the static between the two warring signals. It was the purest form of agony imaginable. The chaotic file screeched to its predetermined end, and then silence. Not the oppressive, pregnant silence of the studio, nor the deafening, roaring silence of the virus. It was a true, profound, and absolute emptiness. For the first time in weeks, the internal broadcast of Acoustic.Zero was gone. The war was over. The tyrannical symphony in his head had ceased. There was only a deep, ringing void in his mind, a sonic vacuum that was more peaceful than anything he had ever known. Then, slowly, tentatively, like the first rays of light after a storm, real-world sounds began to filter back in. The first was a low, steady hum, the hum of the lab's ventilation system. It was imperfect, slightly wavering, and utterly, breathtakingly beautiful. Next came a soft, rhythmic beep, the heart rate monitor beside his cot, his own life measured in imperfect pulses. And then a voice, faint, worried, and wonderfully human. "Alex? Alex, can you hear me?" It was Dr. Hansen, her voice crackling through the intercom. He took a ragged breath, and the sound of it, a wet, messy biological noise, filled his ears. It was the most beautiful sound he had ever heard. "Yes," he whispered, and the sound of his own voice, raw and unused, was a miracle. "I can hear you." The cure was successful, but it came at a cost. The war had left scars on the battlefield. Alex's hearing was permanently altered. He was left with a persistent, high-frequency tinnitus, a constant, faint ringing that was a permanent echo of the battle. He also developed a painful sensitivity, a form of hyperacusis, to certain pure frequencies. The clean, perfect sine wave of a tuning fork or the crystal-clear tones of a high-end audio system were now physically painful to him, sending a jolt of anxiety through his nervous system. He could no longer find joy in the perfect sounds he had once cherished as the pinnacle of audio engineering. His new comfort was in the messy, imperfect, glorious noise of everyday life. The chaotic chatter of a crowd, the rumble of traffic, the off-key singing of a stranger, these were the sounds that felt safe, that felt real. A week later, he returned to his studio. The silent, soundproofed room now felt like a tomb. On his encrypted drive, the file A.0.wave still sat, inert and waiting. Working with Dr. Hansen, he co-authored a stark, detailed paper for the psychoacoustics community, a warning about the theoretical dangers of bioacoustic code and auditory viruses, carefully describing the file's properties and effects without ever sharing the sound itself. It was a message in a bottle, a warning to any other ambitious soul who might follow in Silas's footsteps. Then, with Dr. Hansen watching via video call, he dragged the file to the trash and permanently deleted it. Months passed. Alex was walking through a noisy, vibrant city, finding a strange peace in the symphony of urban chaos. The cacophony was his shield. He passed an open-fronted electronics store, where a salesperson was demonstrating a new, top-of-the-line sound system to a customer. A burst of crystal-clear, high-fidelity music erupted from a wall of speakers, a demonstration track chosen for its flawless production and pristine clarity. In that burst of perfect audio, for just a fraction of a second, buried deep within the mix but unmistakable to his scarred ears, Alex heard it. A familiar, mathematically perfect tone. A single, crystalline click from the ghost in the machine. He flinched, a jolt of pure ice-cold panic. His heart pounded in his chest, a phantom echo rattling in his newly imperfect hearing. He hurried away, swallowed by the noisy, anonymous crowd, a stark, terrifying reminder that you can delete a file, but you can never truly unhear a perfect sound. Enjoyed the story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below.